It's a great pleasure, as I said, to introduce the Reverend Professor David Wilkinson to give the lecture tonight. He's Principal of St John's College in Durham at the moment, and he's also Professor in the Department of Theology and Religion in Durham. But he has an interesting background for this series for a science and religion lecture, because his background is in theoretical astrophysics. So he got a PhD looking at star formation and chemical evolution of galaxies and mass extinctions on Earth, which is something I like as well. Well, I don't really like them, but they're good to work on.
They're good to work on.
But he's also got a PhD in systematic theology, which I certainly have not. So he's talking tonight, and you've probably heard him on Radio 4 if you hear Thought for the Day, because he does that very often, and I certainly appreciate those. But he's talking tonight on exoplanets, aliens, and God. So that's fairly broad, David. So over to you.
Thank you. Bob, thank you very much for your welcome. Thank you for being here this evening. I have a great debt of gratitude both to Faraday and Christians in Science in the way that both organizations helped me over the years think about these relationships between science and faith. And so it's a great privilege to be invited to come and give this public lecture, although I did note, having been here last term, that Rowan Williams was the previous lecturer, which is quite distressing if you happen to be the person who follows Rowan Williams, and will no doubt be distressing for you as well this evening by the end of the lecture. I feel immensely excited, however, to come and talk about a subject which spans so many different questions. I knew it spanned many different questions when on my morning viewing of ITV's morning breakfast show, which of course I was watching primarily for the discussion of a television program called Love Island. In the midst of this extended discussion of Love Island, two other things were happening. The first, would you believe, was a telephone poll going on and text comments on, do you believe that science rules out God? That was interesting in itself. Then two guests were brought on, Sean Ryder of the Happy Mondays and a young scientist to talk about UFOs. So you had Love Island, does God exist, and UFOs, all before 9 a.m. in the morning. It's interesting how this interest in aliens, this interest in extraterrestrial intelligence, spans so many cultural divides, and is often backed with either neglect of the theological voice or a suspicion of the theological voice. I wondered why Sean Ryder from the Happy Mondays was the expert guest in the studio to talk about aliens, and there wasn't a theologian there. Well, aliens also come up in lots of different areas. Some of you will know the comedy show The Big Bang Theory, and central to that is a tension going on between Sheldon, the theoretical astrophysicist, I like to claim, and his mother, a six-day creationist from Texas. And a spin-off series, Young Sheldon, tells the story of the growing up of this young scientific mind in the midst of Bible-thumping creationist literalism. And Sheldon, as a young boy, begins to have a dialogue with Pastor Jeff at his local church. This is something that Pastor Jeff will learn to regret. But Sheldon begins asking questions within sermons, and this is what we get from young Sheldon asking about aliens.
that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son.
Here we go.
Yes, Sheldon?
When you said God gave his Son to the world, did you mean Earth or the universe?
Earth.
But if God created the universe, wouldn't he want to save all of it?
Yes, he would.
Then why did you say Earth?
Earth is a synonym for the universe.
He's grabbing at straws now.
So if God's plan is to save all of the universe, that means a race of octopus aliens light years away could only be saved by Jesus?
Sure.
Even though they never would have heard of him?
Yes.
Even though his appearance might be terrifying to them?
But why would his appearance be terrifying?
He has 4 limbs and they have 8.
Okay, that's enough.
No. I prayed people would be more interested in my sermons. I suppose I should have been more specific. Sheldon, if these creatures were born without sin, they don't need to be saved by Jesus.
What if an octopus Adam and Eve brought sin to their world? Would they be saved by a human Jesus or an octopus Jesus?
And so sums up my lecture. What we're going to do is explore some of those questions, both scientifically and from a theological perspective. In order to do that, I'm conscious of a number of voices which would say, don't do it. Giordano Bruno apparently was burnt at the stake in 1600 for speculating about other worlds. That's often trotted out in these type of lectures. In fact, Bruno's case was much more complicated than that, including a belief that Jesus was somehow some kind of magician. And Thomas Paine, in The Age of Reason, commenting on Christianity and the existence of other worlds, claimed, "He who thinks he believes in both has thought but little of either." Well, I'm going to try and talk about both. And first of all, talk about the way that Christian theology contributed to some of the speculation about other worlds. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the growth of interest in exoplanets, which seems to me to have given a great deal of fuel to the fire of speculation. And then thirdly, we'll return to some of these questions of Christian theology in the next 4 hours or so that we have together. If Plato talked about the maker of the universe distributing souls equal in number to the stars, inserting each of them in each, and Democritus in thinking about the movement and combination of atoms was open to other worlds, it's interesting that amongst the church fathers was an openness to other worlds. Origen saw a variety of creatures in the universe. Athanasius, Basil, and Ambrose in the 4th century were a little more cautious, yet taken with the creativity of God, were again open to the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe. Then along came Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas, you remember, adopted Aristotelian philosophy and synthesized some of it into his theological understanding. The story is sometimes told at that point, the end to speculation about other life came because Aristotle had us at the center of the universe, the planets and stars on crystalline spheres. I think that's a little unfair to Aquinas. Aquinas had this sense of God as the extravagant creator going on. But there was certainly an age where the Christian church had its internal discussions on the existence of other beings. In 1277, the Archbishop of Paris was asked to look into ideas drawn into Christian belief from Aristotle. He issued a condemnation of 219 propositions. It was worse than the House of Parliament on Brexit. And he considered a number which were too restrictive of divine power or omnipotence. The argument being, if God is free to create, who are we to stop God creating in different ways? But I think for me, one of the key theological moves in the work of Nicholas de Cusa, which is to say that physical centrality does not enhance planet Earth and humans. That is, we are special not because of our place in the universe, but because of relationship. That was a key move, which I think opened the door to talk about other creatures, other life forms, other intelligent life. Because one of the problems has always been what makes human beings special. Nicholas also talked about illustrious extraterrestrials close to the sun and lunatics on the moon and all the rest of it. But we begin to see from this point on an increasingly open scientific community. Here we have Richard Bentley and Christian Huygens, who began to look at the universe and the scale of the universe. Of course, I've done a little bit of cheating here. Can we have the lights just down a bit more? What I've done is I've given you some Hubble images of the Hubble Deep Field. They didn't see it like this, but they saw something of the size of the universe. And they both used an argument which went something like this. Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." They said, well, the universe is now, we realize, so big that there's going to be places in the universe which we're never going to see. So how is the glory of God going to be exhibited in places that human beings will never see? Well, they said, there's other life forms out there that will see the glory of God. Now, I don't commend that to you as a theological argument, but it does seem to me to show this openness that there may be other life elsewhere in the universe. Huygens, this was rough astronomy in those days, by the way. This is Huygens' telescope held together by a piece of string almost. It just gives me a chance to say the discussion, it seems to me, was going on between different sides of the church with different issues. Some were saying we need to stick to Aristotle. That's something that's been part of our theological construction. We don't want to get rid of that. There was something fearing that if there was life elsewhere in the universe, intelligent life, that would undercut human status. There was puzzlement over how sin may affect other life elsewhere in the universe. And of course, going with it, salvation. We'll come back to that. How does the Jesus event apply to the whole of the universe? But on the plus side, those who are open were saying God is free to create. God could create diversity of life and intelligent life in the universe. God is a God of extravagance. 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies puts into perspective that little phrase in Genesis 1, he made the stars also. This is a God who creates with such extravagance. The point made by Nicholas and picked up by people like Colin Russell and others, that it was relationship rather than place that defined a special relationship. So to use a silly illustration, I don't need to sit at the head of the table when my family eats to feel special. I can sit anywhere I like. It's the relationship that's key, not the place. The universality of laws, that if life is able to form here, then why not elsewhere? And that, of course, all led to this sense, which was characteristic of the scientific revolution, that in order to find out what God had done, you couldn't work it out simply through logic. You had to observe the universe. You had to see what God has done. You had to do science. I welcome. In fact, as some of you know, this was played upon by opponents, and particularly a sermon preached in Florence in 1614 by Tommaso Cassini attacking Galileo by using the words of Scripture in a little play of words, echoing Acts 1 verse 11. Ye man of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up at the heavens? This was a criticism of observational science. And yet, I think there's something very strong in this to say that if God is free to create, we need to observe. And that's why I'm a great supporter of SETI programs. They're not that expensive compared to certain other scientific programs, we might say. And I think, although they're very difficult to do, part of the last 30 years has shown that we can have some success in these programs. And so let me move on now to what we've discovered about exoplanets. Up until about 1995, the only planets that we really knew about were the planets in our own solar system around the sun. Within the Oort cloud, something that Bob and I have had an interest in, because it maybe was the Oort cloud that disturbed comets. Comets in the Oort cloud were disturbed and may have led to the dinosaur extinction. But the only planets we knew about were within this. Now, even in our own backyard, we're beginning to learn that there are other stars with planets. Here in the Alpha Centauri system, we have a number of planets, Earth-like planets, I'll show you in a moment. Barnard's star here, which is a dwarf star, has, again, a super-Earth planet. That's a slightly bigger Earth. And this is all within 4 to 6 light years of where we are. These aren't, well, they are vast astronomical distances to most of us, apart from those of us who got the train down from Durham today. But they're not the vast astronomical distances between galaxies. And one of the most extraordinary things is that since 1995, we are beginning to see so many extrasolar planets. In fact, I have an app on my iPhone which informs me of when a new planet is discovered, which happens often very frequently. This is an artist's impression of the Earth-side planet around Proxima Centauri. It would take distances 4.25 light years. With current technology, that's a very long journey indeed, and would probably, well, let's say it would cost more than building a wall between USA and Mexico. It would be at least that type of expenditure, 10% of the US gross national product to do that, and it would take a long time. But some of you will know, what about putting a little piece of metal at the end of a laser and just pumping it forward very quickly with some information on it? Maybe 20 years to send something like that to the planet at Proxima Centauri. That's within our lifetime. Now, whether the people or the aliens who were there could actually see the arrival of this little piece of metal or even understand what it was about, that's another question, of course. But you see how some of these things are beginning to come into everyday consciousness. I can't guarantee that this is up to date. This is only up to date from yesterday. And that is, at the moment, we know of 3,912 extrasolar planets in 2,914 planetary systems, with at least over 600 being multiple planetary systems. And here's the date of discovery here against the mass of the planet as a ratio of the mass of Jupiter. Now, as you can tell, in the early days, we only saw very large planets, planets the size of Jupiter. As time has gone on and the techniques have developed, we've begun to see Earth-like planets, and many of them. We've seen planets where there are 2 stars, binary star systems with planets. That was most unexpected. In fact, if you're a Star Wars nerd, you'll know that Tatooine with 2 suns, actually, we've seen something like that. And the bizarre nature of planets and planetary systems has quite surprised our expectations in all of this. Now let's just do a little bit of science together, because this is fascinating. I find this just a fascinating story in the way that we've been able to see extrasolar planets. Because of course, if you're close to a planet and a star, fairly easy to distinguish. If you move away a considerable distance, then the planet itself is swallowed by the glare of its own star. You can't see the planet. It's like trying to find a little torch beside a searchlight. And the story of how we've discovered extrasolar planets, I think, is a really neat, cool scientific story. And there have been 3 methods by which mainly this has been done. The first is to say that, of course, as planets orbit a star, they have their own gravitational attraction, which means that the star slightly wobbles as the planet goes round. Can you see how the star wobbles? Well, very difficult, apart from something called the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect says that if an object which is emitting light moves towards you, then the light is slightly bluer that you see. If it moves away from you, slightly redder than you see. And so the radial velocity method here has our planet going around, and here's our star, and we're looking at the colors from the star, and you see that as it moves backwards and forwards, you get blue shift and red shift. And you're able to measure that, and that tells you a little bit about the orbit of the planet and the minimum mass. That's method number 1. Method number 2 is that occasionally you might have the situation where a planet moves in front of its host star. And if you look at the brightness curve, then you can see that little dip in brightness as the planet moves across. Now you might say, well, that's a very special situation. You're going to have to be very lucky to be able to see a planet move across the disk of its own star. Well, yes, but the universe is very big. I mean, it has lots of stars. Therefore, by watching lots of stars, you do get lucky. And the Kepler spacecraft, that was what it did. It looked at a particular part of the sky here, and it just tracked stars where the brightness curve dipped. And it was extremely successful for a time. These are some of the planetary systems that Kepler discovered. Then I'm afraid it lost its bearings completely as some of its gyros failed, but NASA was able to rehabilitate and just allow it to look at different parts of the sky. Unfortunately, it's now gone, but it did a great deal of very important work in that. So that's method 2. Method 3 is just even cooler, if I can say that, in academic company. And that is to say that you remember that in Einstein's general theory of relativity, the presence of mass warps space-time. As light travels through warped space-time, it follows the curvature. Light is bent by the presence of mass. And so, if you have a background star, which you're looking at, and a star moves in front of it, there's a little effect. The light from the background star is curved, warped, acts as a bit of a lens. and you see a little rise in brightness due to this gravitational lensing effect. But not only do you see it from the star, if the configuration is just right, you see it from the planet as well. And you get that little peak there. Extrasolar microlensing. Now, from those three techniques, you get a wealth of data. And so part of the growth in this has been to say, okay, where do we go next? So Kepler, I'm afraid, is no longer, well, it's dead. TESS is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite. I just started to see planets in the last little while, few days and weeks, 3 or so, and it's just beginning to take up Kepler's task. The James Webb Telescope, which is a successor to Hubble, which we've been waiting for about 200 years to be launched or so, will be the next stage ahead in this. And this is a way of saying that not only might we be able to see the existence of exoplanets, but with some of the resolution of James Webb, we might be able to say something about the atmosphere of these exoplanets. So this is where we are as in yesterday. Don't quote me on it today, please. 3,912 exoplanets broken down into a large number which are gas giants, Jupiter, Neptune-like, quite a few super-Earths, and then 156 Earth-like planets. So we're getting to a stage where we know something about the existence of Earth-like planets, but, of course, a bit more complicated than that if you want a home to life. First of all, you've got to have the right kind of stars. So you need stars that are going to have a long lifetime, that are going to be stable over that lifetime. Our star here is G-type star, and we found a planet around a G-type star called Kepler 452b. Not only do we need the right kind of star, but we need the distance between the star and the planet to be just right, so that temperature's just right, because we think that life needs liquid water to form. And so we talk about a habitable zone. Planets being in just the right distance from stars. And here we are, the solar system, and here's our friend Kepler 452b, and that is in the habitable zone of its star system. But then it's not just that. There are other things going on as well. You notice this little thing called Mars within the so-called habitable zone of the Earth? Well, yes, but Mars looks very different now. So something's been going on with Mars, which means it's not just about being in the habitable zone or being roughly the right size. Much more complicated than that. And so alongside these telescopes, landers increasingly on Mars, this one with the hope of trying to drill down a little bit to see what kind of seismic activity has been going on. Hopefully at some point to land something that will drill further down, maybe try and find something under the permafrost of primitive life or fossilized primitive life or something of that sort. So it's a very interesting area. Now, this may carry some of us off into flights of fancy. There's lots of planets out there, and you could say maybe 50% of stars at least have planets. Some of them are Earth-like planets. Some of them are in the habitable zone, the right temperature. Some of them have the right kind of stars. Does that mean that there's got to be another Earth out there? And if there's another Earth out there, then surely that means, some people say, intelligent life. You've got to be silly if you say there's 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies. If only 10% have possibility, well, you know the type of argument. And part of that is based on a claim that life itself is very easy for it to arise. So that when Miller and Urey in the University of Chicago put gases into their test tube, which they claimed were what the early Earth was like, and passed electrical and magnetic discharge through it, and got a red-brown sludge of amino acids, very quickly people make the jump and say, well, if you can create life in a test tube in the University of Chicago, surely you should be able to do it just about anywhere. Well, no, let's hold on a moment. Two reasons, I think, why we may be skeptical about the existence of intelligent life within at least our galaxy. The first is this, and may I put it like this. It's a long way from an amino to an accountant. Well, anyway, that's up to you to think about. What we do know, and biologists tend to be a little more skeptical than physicists on this question, because they know that you need conditions, very sensitive conditions, to bring about complex and then intelligent and self-conscious life. And by the way, it's not entirely clear what intelligent or self-conscious really mean and how we understand it. So it may be that we have lots of primitive life, lots of bacteria throughout our galaxy. That's not very interesting for Star Trek to boldly go and seek out yet more bacteria. But it's possible, and we often in popular discourse don't make the distinction between life and intelligent life. The second reason why we should be just a little hesitant comes from Enrico Fermi at a luncheon in the 1950s. He and some friends had gone out to lunch, and they were talking and having a bit of fun with a couple of stories that had been in the newspapers over the past few days. One of those stories was someone claimed to have seen a flying saucer. Another story was the mysterious disappearance of trash cans in New York City. And in a famous cartoon in the New Yorker, these were put together as a causal connection. And so they were having a bit of fun about this, talking about whether indeed flying saucers were the best types of interstellar spacecraft. And Fermi went into one of his silencers. What he was doing a quick calculation inside his head, and halfway through the luncheon, after being silent, he looked up and said, "Where is everybody?" He wasn't making a comment on how many people were in the restaurant. What he'd done was a pretty neat calculation, which was to say, if a civilization arose within a galaxy the size of the Milky Way, and if that civilization wanted to colonize the Milky Way, visit every star, how long would it take? So you can imagine a program where you send out self-replicating robots. When they reach stars with planets with the right resources, they make copies of themselves and send out further robots. And you can build into this timescales where you find two self-replicators arriving at the same place, of things crashing, of them not being able to find the right ingredients for replication, all the rest of it. And not only can you do that, but you can also look at how various island chains were also settled in our own time. And you can do the mathematics, as Fermi did, pretty well in his head, and come out to say that a civilization would colonize every star in our Milky Way in a time less than 300 million years. Now, that's not a long time scale in one sense. It's not a long time scale if you compare it to the age of our Milky Way galaxy of 10 billion years. So Fermi's paradox was, if they existed, they would be here. If they existed in our galaxy, we would have seen them. Leo Szilard, famous Hungarian physicist, responded to Fermi's paradox by saying, if they existed, they would be here by saying, well, they do exist and they're called Hungarians. That was his response. Of course, that raises a huge amount of public interest in questions of whether we are a visited planet, and hoaxes and conspiracies and all of the rest of it. And I don't want to neglect that. I just don't have time this evening to deal with it. I'm not convinced that there's enough evidence for that. And so for what it's worth, and it's not worth very much, my own view at the moment, largely due to Fermi's paradox, is to say that we may be alone as intelligent life in this galaxy. It's not to say there's not other life, but intelligent life. But the Fermi paradox doesn't rule out intelligent life in other parts of the universe, in other galaxies. But the problem there is a real problem, and that's a problem of communication. For if an intelligent civilization in Andromeda, one of our nearest galactic neighbors, sent out a message and said, hello, is there anyone there? It would take a couple of million years to reach us. If we sent back a message saying, yes, we're here, who are you? That's another couple of million years. That's not an interesting conversation, to put it bluntly. Now, forgive the silliness, but if you continue with that, then it may be that there's intelligent civilizations beyond the ability for us ever to be in communication with. And so there may be intelligent life, but we may never encounter it. I'm going to move on, if I may. I've talked a little bit about some of the science and perhaps some of the interest that's been caused by extrasolar planets. Let me move on back to where we began, which is, what does this mean for theological questions, challenges, insights? Well, four things first in terms of some of the discourse around the implications of extraterrestrial intelligence. This is, if we did find some evidence for life beyond the Earth. The first comes from Paul Davies, interesting enough. And that is that for Professor Davies, this would strengthen belief in some form of cosmic design. To quote, if life is widespread in the universe, it gives us more, not less, reason to believe in cosmic design. The belief that Paul has that in some way the emergence of life is written into the laws of physics, that life widespread would show that. Of course, Davies became famous for a great deal of work on what he called the Goldilocks enigma. And I think that's a whole area where we've talked about how much one can recreate or rejuvenate the argument for design within the astrophysics of the universe. My own view is to follow John Polkinghorne on this and to say that there may be pointers but not proofs. There may be questions, not answers in this. But I think Professor Davies has something to say in terms of how we would interpret widespread life in the universe. Second is a very different point. And this is that if we did encounter intelligent life, this would be the end of earthly religions. This comes from Jill Cornell-Tarter, sometimes called the mother of SETI, certainly one of the leading research scientists in the area of SETI. And she argues, I quote, that if we detected extraterrestrial intelligence, we would discover that long-lived extraterrestrials either never had or have outgrown organized religion. So they would bring their religions to the earth, and we would suddenly see just how ancient the Church of England really is and move away from it. I think this is a difficult position to argue. For her, religion really means philosophical development. She has no concept which underlies the Judeo-Christian tradition of revelation, that God gives the gift of knowledge of himself. It's not just how we work out God in the universe. And therefore, I think it's a misdirected critique in terms of the problem of extraterrestrial intelligence. Third, and I'm loath to mention it, but I think I have to, because some of it is from the rather more disturbing fringe of some of this discourse. And that is the old claim that God is an alien, or that the religious accounts within the Old and New Testament are not about a God interacting with people, but about spaceships. Jeff Brumlick's famous book, The Spaceships of Ezekiel, interprets Ezekiel 1 as a flying saucer. It's interesting how often that's picked up by very reputable commentators, as if there's something in it. Well, at face value, without very many bits of research, well, there might be some parallels between shining astronaut suits and flames of fire and all the rest of it. But with many things, you need to stay with the text. You need to understand the text within its context. And Ezekiel 1 reads very differently. The same is those who've interpreted the New Testament and Jesus as an astronaut, with things like the Ascension as beam me up Scotty and all the rest of it. I think one puts the events alongside the words, the teaching, the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And for me, it just doesn't make sense once you take the texture of Scripture sufficiently seriously enough. However, there is an argument that there would be problems for the Christian faith, and Paul Davis a number of years ago picked out two. He said there would be two problems for the Christian faith. The first would be that Christians wouldn't be able to understand the special nature of human beings. And secondly, Christians would not be able to understand the universal nature of the death of Jesus. Now, both of those, I think, are worth us pausing just for a moment on. I think the first, however, is dependent on that old Aristotelian view that it's place, not relationship, that makes us special. I think the history of Christian thought shows that it's moved beyond that. And that if God decided in creation to have other intelligent beings, not just human beings, then our unique relationship is not undercut by the existence of other intelligent beings. And indeed, Christians believe that we are special as human beings because God has reached out in grace, formed a relationship, and confirmed that in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But I think the second, and that is the nature of how we interpret the Jesus event, does have some complexities and puzzlement to it. Arthur Peacock said, "Does not the mere possibility of extraterrestrial life render nonsensical all the superlative claims made by the Christian Church about the significance of Jesus?" It's the issue of particularity, and that is how a particular set of events around the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth can be universal or not. And this is where there's been healthy debate amongst Christians. E.A. Milne, distinguished professor of mathematics at Oxford, committed Roman Catholic, said, "I cannot imagine another crucifixion on another world." The problem with Milne's view is that eventually that leads him to a position where Christians have to become cosmic missionaries. And I'm afraid that's a very long missionary journey. His view was opposed by E.L. Maskell in the Bampton Lectures in 1956, where Maskell said, if there are, I quote, in some other parts of the universe, rational corporate beings who have sinned and are in need of redemption, for those beings and for their salvation, the Son of God has united, or one day will unite, to his divine person their nature, as he has united it to ours. And some of you will know that within the Christian tradition of liturgy and hymnody, Sidney Carter, the Christmas hymn, who can tell what other cradle high above the Milky Way still may rock the King of Heaven on another Christmas Day. Now, the complications of this, I think we need to take seriously. And by that I mean that the incarnation of Jesus and his work on the cross for Christians bring together two things. The first is God shows us what he's like, reveals himself in becoming flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. But at the same time, God saves us from sin through the work of the cross. Those of you who know your C.S. Lewis will know that Lewis explored the possibility of civilizations that may have never sinned. So, first of all, does God's incarnation and redemption always go together or not? Next, is that a necessity for salvation? Or, as Andrew Davison here in Cambridge has argued, is this more about a suitability of God's redemptive work? I think this is one of the areas that I'm prepared to say I just don't know. I'm still working it through. I don't have a problem with sensing that a particular can lead to a universal. Origen talked about Christ's redemptive work as a transcendent action which gradually through time takes effect in every realm of creation, but which nevertheless needs to find corporeal expression in a particular place on a particular occasion, that is on Calvary. And you'll notice that as an astrophysicist I've done a very cheeky thing, which is I've taken an illustration from gravitational waves and included it on my slide, as if to say, just as the particular interaction of two black holes billions of light years away has an effect on the space-time, however small, of this world, a particular can have an effect on a universal, seems to me, in a spiritual way. I'm nearly finished for those of you, by the way, who are desperate to get out and look at the night sky. One last section, is that all right? I think I want to conclude by saying that we need to be careful about putting our own assumptions upon others. If the question of the work of Jesus is a particular difficulty for Christians to think through, it doesn't seem to be a horrendous difficulty. Ted Peters did an interesting piece of research a little while ago, interviewing 1,000 or so people of faith, and asked them the question, would the discovery of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe be a problem for you? To which 70% replied, no, no problem at all. He then asked people without faith whether people of faith would have a problem with the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. To which 70% of people without faith said, yes, they will have a problem. I think, actually, people of faith think these things through. And so, finally, what might the borderlands, the conversation of Settian theology look like in the future? Well, I think there's something about theologians recognizing the religious language the religious concepts, the religious dimension of SETI. In both the science and within science fiction and within some of what we might call the X-File phenomenon, there are themes of loneliness. Are we alone in the universe? Of purpose, how we discover what our purpose or the purpose of the universe is about. Identity, noting on Valentine's Day that we normally discover our own identity in the other rather than seeing it ourselves. Something about fear, which is played on science fiction, our vulnerability in the vastness of the universe. And as Fred Hoyle in 1949 pointed out, that a great deal of motivation for believing in extraterrestrial intelligence is the belief that there is something that will come and save us from ourselves. Theme of salvation. And then I think there's something about the challenge to theology, which is about our own small way of envisaging the universe, of making God in our own image. Your God is too small, says J.B. Phillips. And I think thirdly, I think the contribution of theology to SETI is a discussion about the nature of extraterrestrial intelligence, not least fallenness and goodness, something about the consequences of future contact. What are the protocols if, however unlikely, the little green women and little green men arrive? I have to say I don't have a great deal of confidence if Donald Trump is going to be the person who's going to welcome the little green women and men. And I think, for me, there's something really important that in order to see what God has done, we need to observe, we need to look. The importance to encourage and affirm SETI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We have a little bit of time for questions, and then there'll be a drinks reception at the back, and you'll be around to chat to if you'd like to then, I'm sure.
I don't know whether you or anybody else here knows that remarkable poem by Alice Meynell, written about 100 years ago, which ends with that wonderful thing, "In the eternities, doubtless we shall compare together. Here in what guise he trod the Pleiades, the lyre, the bear. Oh, be prepared, my soul, to read the inconceivable, to scan the million forms of God those stars unroll, when in our turn we shout at them, a man." And I think that, as 100 years ago, had a very clear idea that the life of Christ was God expressing himself in human terms so that we can't understand much about the creator of the universe, but we could understand as much as we need to understand, and that he would have done that wherever else there is intelligent life.
Well, thank you, and you quoted very well. I mean, there's a number of things that immediately spark off in my mind, and that is the reminder, the caution in that. As we get, as if my colleague Tom McLeish was here to say, as we get in the book of Job particularly, the sense that God is always the greater, always beyond our ability, and yet at the same time is the one who speaks. It's interesting the role of science fiction in this as well, poetry and narrative, and the ability of science fiction authors to explore concepts in a free way. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there's not an easy equation which goes from science fiction to science fact. But there's an interesting, I think, in the 20th century, a great deal of science fiction writing came out of Roman Catholic thinking. And I think, I'd speculate, that some of that was motivated by the church pre-Vatican II. And it was a way to ask the question, is there salvation outside the church without mentioning Protestants. Okay? Now that for me means that science fiction, and indeed some of these theological speculations, can act as a kind of theological sandpit for us to play in, to question each other, to challenge each other. The implications of some of these issues about incarnation, redemption, many other things, play out in the very important and sensitive political realities of how Christians and other faith communities relate and talk together. But at the moment, science fiction and some of this scientific speculation is quite a nice sandpit in which to explore in the way that you said. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering why, if we think there is intelligent life out there that has fallen, why do we think that God is in a way obliged to save them? Because in the Bible, we know that there are angelic beings which are fallen, but we also, I think it's probably true that no salvation was ever offered to intelligent angelic beings which fell. And we also know that salvation for us is an undeserved mercy entirely of God's choice. So I don't understand why we must say that God is obliged to save fallen intelligent creatures.
It's a very helpful point. Thank you very much. And there's much to mine in that point, which is about necessity, suitability, and grace. Is grace obliged, as you very eloquently put it, to respond to sin? And the Bible, the biblical witness, does have these odd characters within them. And some of the mystery of this is never solved. So I think we have to be, I think your point acts as a caution, a theological caution, just to say, don't push the necessity part too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in your idea of a theological sandpit, but I think there is also a mathematical sandpit, and we hear a lot about the wonders of mathematics at Faraday. Could you say something more about it, please?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, I mean, this is a profound area, and can I just say one or two things? That if we were to have a longer conversation in our two sandpits that we now have, these are some of the things I'd want to play with. The first is the way that mathematics becomes the language by which we understand and express the nature of the universe. Not all of the universe, but part of the universe. And then there's a whole number of questions that flow from that, which is how the non-mathematician understands and how the physicist or mathematician helps the non-mathematician to understand. And so when Professor Hawking used to talk about the origin of the universe, he struggled often to try and get an everyday illustration that would sum up in some way the way that the mathematics just worked at t to the minus 43 of a second, or at when time and space fade into one thing. So there's something about that. Then I think there's something about the way that mathematics and imagination are connected, and the way that the mathematician can imagine the world in different ways and be stimulated to imagine the world in different ways. And then I think there's something which is, of course, about the ontological reality of mathematics or not. And that is, does mathematics flow out of the creativity and faithfulness of God? Or does mathematics has its own existence and reality? Now, I'm of the former camp rather than the latter. And once I begin to talk about mathematics flowing out of the faithfulness, I'm starting to sound a little like Sir James Jeans with God the divine mathematician. And so I've got to be careful not to say that God is simply a boring egghead mathematician, but God is also, we've got another sandpit as well, God is the divine artist, the one who creates with extravagance going on. So I don't want to reduce the universe just to its mathematical core. So those would be some of the things, I think, for me, if we were to have a longer conversation, we might talk about. And then there'd be lots, I'm sure, that you would give to me on that.
Thank you. The scriptures speak of the events that led to the bondage of the creation in a very geocentric way. These were events that happened on Earth.
Yes.
And similarly, the events that will lead to the winding up of the creation, again, presented in a very geocentric fashion. And I just wonder if there's been much theological thought in the area of creation and eschatology and the implications of that for SETI.
Thank you. The answer is no, not to my knowledge, apart from little bits that I've tried to do myself over the years and not terribly successfully, and little bits. The issue is really interesting, and that is if you read a typical commentator like Cranfield on Romans 8, for example, Cranfield talks about how because this great orchestra, human beings are out of tune. The great conductor of the orchestra isn't really got it together, and therefore the whole creation is out of tune. As you rightly said, that's a very geocentric, anthropomorphic view of the universe in bondage. And yet there are other parts of Scripture which just push this nature of creation being good but not new creation. This was John Wesley's great image. And being a Methodist, I'm under contract to mention the name of Wesley at every talk that I ever do. But Wesley's image of new creation in the individual, then in the community, and then in the whole creation, said that there was a relationship, but it wasn't reducible back to the new creation of the human being. And so in a very interesting sermon called The General Deliverance, Wesley talked about the future in new creation of cats and dogs. Now the significance of that was to say, what is God's purposes in the new creation of the natural world apart from human beings? And therefore there's an issue which isn't just about SETI, but is about the whole of the natural creation, which may include lots of different life forms. I mean, I hesitate to say this, but I touch on it a little bit in a book called Christian Eschatology in the Physical Universe. Just a little bit, not very much. There's much more to be written on that. So, yeah, thank you.
Should we take one last question?
Hi, so I was thinking about the sort of long-term plans of the people who built the cathedrals many years ago. They had no idea whether they'd ever finish. They didn't live long enough to find out. To what extent can Christianity or our religions help sponsor our expansion into the universe? It'd be quite fun to be all over the place in 300 million years' time.
Well, what an interesting question. And the parallel with the cathedral is very interesting, as my office is 400 yards from Durham Cathedral. And as you say, the sense of building for the future in a way that you might not see yourself is fascinating. I think if the message of Jesus in discipleship is to be salt and light in all areas of science, which Faraday and Christians in Science have championed in enormous ways over the generations, then I think there's a challenge here for us to be salt and light. We're beginning to be at the stage now where how we use the surface and resources of Mars, either for exploration or for exploitation, is a real issue. Do we allow the big energy conglomerates to use the resources of Mars? Do we terraform Mars to provide some kind of different environment? At which point, by the way, I suspect it'll be only the rich who go from the Earth that's dying to this new, so there's ethical questions there. And also just the joy of exploring. Now, Sir Robert Boyd, a great hero of mine, a great founder of a Research Scientist Christian Fellowship, was quite an opponent of human exploration of space. He felt that it was too dangerous and that everything could be done by robots and computers, and certainly in his area of remote sensing, that was the case. But I'm a child who sat watching the Apollo landing and going, wow, gosh. And I think there's something about placing our feet on the physicality of the creation that God's given us. And so in terms of financial, political funding of SETI and in terms of space exploration, I'm a supporter. I realize the difficulties of how you balance science funding with those who are in great need here on the earth. But I do think that that long-term view, which you eloquently described, is a very important view for us.